It's a book launch, so I'm going to read my two favourite bits from the book. Unfortunately, this is a book that's mainly comprised of other people's writing and other people's work. Essentially, I took scholarship like this and distilled it down into that. So I took all the best bits out, and the bits I'm going to read tonight are about the Anglo-Saxon journey of the coffin around Anglo-Saxon England and the construction of the cathedral and the symbolism of that. So it's only two short bits, but even those I owe a debt of thanks to Professor David Rollison, Durham University's expert on Anglo-Saxon England, and a lot of the insights are indeed his. So all I've done really is rewrite them. So I'm going to do two short readings about the story of the Anglo-Saxon guardians and the Norman takeover of the guardianship of the coffin and its contents. This is one of the difficulties with writing this book, was that the only thing we know about what happened in the Anglo-Saxon period when the coffin was moving around has been told to us by the Normans. So it's kind of like trying to work out what the last Labour government did from what the present coalition government says about it. And again, this is Professor Rawson's work, but I'm very pleased with these two bits because they sort of bring in the symbolic narrative, which is one of the tiny bits of value I think I've added to the story. So this will only be 5 minutes on the Anglo-Saxons and 5 minutes on the Normans. So for those of you who are standing, you don't have to stand for too long. So this is, so they found the incorrupt, unrotted body of St Cuthbert when they dug him up in 698. And then it became a place of pilgrimage. So why would you not go to Lindisfarne? In a world where illness was not understood, why would you not go to place your fragile self or hold your sick child near such power? In the years immediately after the discovery, the biographies written by the anonymous monk and by Bede were copied and sent around England and Europe. Their work announced the miracle of Cuthbert's incorrupt corpse, and it became widely known that in the north of England, across the tidal flats of an island called Lindisfarne, there lay the body of a man so perfectly devout that the mechanisms of death itself had been put on hold by the pure intensity of his faith. Instead of a cadaver seething with corruption, his corpse was as close to a living man as a dead mortal could become. So why would you not go to Lindisfarne? If his body did not obey the laws of corruption, it must mean the saint was close to God and so could intercede on your behalf. If his body did not decompose, it must be radiating a power that could hold the horrors of disease and corruption at bay. So if you could, why would you not go to bathe in such a life-giving emanation? And naturally, along with their desire to be well and whole, the pilgrims brought items to exchange because they had to live and rest and eat while they were on pilgrimage. So it was understandable that it would be the monks they would turn to for these necessities. Along with their barter goods and coins, the pilgrims also brought gifts, sometimes golden jewellery and sometimes gifts of land, which they could exchange for spiritual wealth, both in the here and now and in the hereafter. So in the 100 or so years after the death of Cuthbert, the monastery and its monks grew rich, however sincere their intentions. It was this wealth and the vulnerability to the sea that also attracted the Vikings, and Lindisfarne became the first place in England to be raided. This is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the year 793. In this year, dire fall warnings came over the land of the Northumbrians and miserably terrified the people. There were excessive whirlwinds and lightnings, and fiery dragons were seen flying into the air. A great famine soon followed these tokens, and a little after that, in the same year, on the 6th of the Ides of January, the havoc of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne through rapine and slaughter. And this is the monastic community's memory of the event as it was recorded 300 years later. The pagans from the northern region came with a naval armament to Britain, like stinging hornets, and overran the country in all directions, like fierce wolves, plundering, tearing, and killing not only sheep and oxen, but priests and Levites, and choirs of monks and nuns. They came, as we before said, to the church of Lindisfarne, and laid all waste with dreadful havoc, trod with unhallowed feet the holy places, dug up the altars, and carried all the treasures of the holy church. Some of the brethren they killed, some they carried off in chains, many they cast out, naked and loaded with insults. Some they drowned in the sea. Over the next 150 years, first through raids and then through invasion and settlement, the Vikings carved apart the Northumbrian kingdom that Bede and Cuthbert had helped to create. As a consequence, in the spring of 875, and after decades of attacks, the monastery took the decision to leave Lindisfarne in order to find a place of safety inland. The monks dismantled the timbers of their first church and packed them onto carts. They lugged their ancient stone cross out of the ground and added it to the load. They dug up and disinterred the bones of their founder and their previous bishops, packing alongside these relics the battle-cracked skull of King Oswald. With great reverence, they secured the wonder of their gospel book, with its intricate designs, brilliant colours, and perfect calligraphy. Finally, they prepared a great chest, a travelling coffin covered in hides to guard against the elements. This would transport the now antique coffin reliquary, concealed within, whose angelic apostolic carvings lay the community's most precious and revered essence. The miracle-working, sanctuary-granting, divine portal that was the incorrupt corpse of St Cuthbert. A Praetorian guard of 7 young monks was chosen to protect and attend to the corpse on its journey. It was a responsibility so great that the 7 were to become heroes, and their descendants were to be venerated for generations. We still know some of their names: Hundred, Stitherd, Edmund, and Franco. The great procession would surely have sung and lamented as it crossed the Strand onto the mainland, just as the monks sang to greet Cuthbert's body on its return from farm. Carrying everything with them that made them a monastery, surrounded by their families, their retainers and their livestock, the monks left Lindisfarne to join the muddy, cobble-strewn scar and mark the vestiges of the old Roman road. The legend that has come down to us is that this is a journey of flight and fear, in which a desperate, dwindling band of true believers, their monastic discipline dying on the road, hid out in the swamps and forests of the north from the pagan invaders. But through the breakdown of record-keeping and secular authority, it's possible to sense the monastery was doing something much more strategic. The monks appear to be taking the one thing that gave them power, the incorrupt corpse, and transporting it to the place where that power could have the most impact, to the lands that had been given as gifts to Cuthbert and which they needed to secure. In a complex 7 years of movements across the north of England, the corpse and its guardians went through a succession of relocations. In fits and starts, the corpse was first taken west to Norham, then back to Lindisfarne, then further west to Whitehall and the mouth of the Derwent on the Irish Sea. Next they turned southeast to Crake before establishing themselves around 883 in the possibly still defensible remains of the old Roman fort at Chester Street. It is likely no coincidence that the geography of this journey sketches out the land holdings of the Lindisfarne monastery within the vestiges of the kingdom of Northumbria. Instead of flight and fear, the sequence of relocations can be seen as a tactical withdrawal followed by a royal progress through their lands. The monastery seems to be engaged in a series of strategic visitations to its estates, visitations in which the coffin is presented like a crown or a seal, as a symbol of overlordship as powerful as if the saint himself were present. But what is most telling is that apart from the journey west to the Irish Sea coast, which is associated in legend with an attempt to flee to Ireland, the community spent much of its time taking the corpse towards the Viking areas of control. They engaged with the invaders and they secured their legacy. And when the resurgent Anglo-Saxon kings do eventually return to the north in the middle of the 10th century, one element of the old kingdom of Northumbria remains. It is to the corpse of St Cuthbert to which the victorious House of Wessex comes to pay penance. It is the heirs of King Alfred who come to Chester Street to bring tribute to the political and feudal power embodied by the corpse. So that's the Anglo-Saxon bit. And then the Normans come along, they have to sort of rewrite this. So there's just a couple of pages on the Normans' creation of the cathedral, and what I like about it is the contrast between the roving Gestalt lordship of the Anglo-Saxons and the monumental permanence of the cathedral. It shows a very different conception about the future. It was not the Normans who moved Cuthbert's corpse to Durham, but their Anglo-Saxon predecessors. After just over a century in Chester Street, they must have seen in this final resting place a fitting site. A hill surrounded on three sides by a deep looping river gorge. It was imposing and defensible. But perhaps they also found it fitting because it symbolised their origins. In their mind's eye, the hill encircled by the river would have reminded them of Lindisfarne and how it too was looped in by water, by a circling of the flood tide that only closed itself around the island twice a day. Perhaps they saw even further, back across the sea to the Irish origins of Cuthbert's Christianity and to the very beginnings of Celtic spirituality, to the mystical in the water. The Normans may not have chosen Durham, but they did make it permanent. They began building the cathedral in 1093, and the creation of this vast mausoleum put a monumental end to the concept that the corpse could travel. However, unlike the monarchy and earldoms of England, the Normans could not simply usurp the native incumbents with violence. In the north, it was the entity called St Cuthbert who was the local lord, and as incorrupt as Cuthbert's corpse was, it was already dead. In this context, the Normans therefore had to justify the transfer of sovereignty, and they did this by writing their own history of the corpse. The man chosen to create the Norman narrative was a monk called Simeon. He seems to have come over from Normandy in 1091 and rose to become the chief scribe of the monastery. Among other tasks, we know he copied out the Durham versions of Bede's Life of Cuthbert, compiled various annals, and generally made himself an expert on the history of the monastery. All of this was preparation for his great justificatory narrative, a tract on the origins and progress of the Church of Durham, the book that demonstrated that the Norman guardianship of Cuthbert's legacy was legitimate because they were restoring Cuthbert to the true Benedictine tradition of real monks. So, instead of seeing the Anglo-Saxon guardians as sophisticated power brokers securing their land during the dislocation of the Viking attacks, Simeon's tract presents them as fleeing in terror and dwindling to a small band of hereditary priests, or clerks, as he dismissively calls them. They were no longer monks in anything but name, he implies. They may have sung like monks, but they raised children like ordinary men. Most of the famous Cuthbert legends come from his version of the corpse's history. The flight to Ireland, the dropping of the Lindisfarne Gospels into the water, the saint turning the sea red to indicate his displeasure at their attempt to escape to England, to Ireland. It is Simeon who emphasises the guardian's almost accidental role in the founding of Durham. The milkmaid, the dun cow, the cart carrying the coffin getting caught in the mire. In this way, the inheritors of Bede and Cuthbert, the creators of the Lindisfarne Gospels, the astute politicians of the Viking Age, who received tribute from the heirs of King Alfred, they are turned into clumsy, suggestible cart hands, unworthy of the possession of such profound power. Simeon's book was only a kind of prequel, a justificatory companion volume to the profound symbolic and public ceremony of the coffin's transference to its ultimately permanent, immovable encasement in the new cathedral. As if to underline the point, on the day of what is known as the translation, 29th of August 1104, the Normans paraded the coffin outside for the last time. And this is how one chronicler, Willem of Malmesbury, describes it. The sight was a splendid one. The churchyard was the scene. The sky was clear. No black cloud deadened the beams of the sun. The monks were all arrayed in the robes of their order, and there were long lines of men going and returning, treading, in fact, upon each other's heels, from their intense anxiety to view again and again the sight they had seen. Perhaps this was a kind of triumphant burlesque, taking the coffin outside and marching it around their vast new building. Perhaps in some way the Normans were aping their Anglo-Saxon predecessors with their tiny wooden churches and their pathetic parading of the body around their lands, like the waving of objects. Taking the coffin out to the waiting crowds, trampling over each other in their excitement, created a public statement of power and exaltation. We possess the body, the miracle of the incorrupt corpse is ours. Thank you very much indeed.